How are you?
Good. I understand you need to take a break for a few minutes in the middle. Is that correct?
Yes. Is that all right?
How long?
It has to be all right.
About how long?
I'm actually in charge of the shelf exam for the first-year med students. I have to go read them the directions.
You think it'd be 15 minutes?
Yeah, I think that should be fine.
Okay, great. So good morning. So today we're excited to have as our speaker Dr. Paula Gregory. She's a professor in the Department of Genetics and also in the Department of Cell Biology and Anatomy at LSU Health Science Center in New Orleans. She's also, I think, the director of the Faculty Development Program at LSU. She's got a very strong interest in educating and career development especially for early career faculty, but people at all career levels. She's worked extensively with NIH to develop programs both that are delivered on the NIH campus as well as in off-campus sites. And today she's going to talk about how to write an abstract. I just want to take a moment before she starts to let you know that we'll be having more discussion of your abstracts in a few weeks. I'll be sending out sort of recommended format for abstracts that will be based partly on things that Dr. Gregory presents today and also just my own biases and experiences as suggestions. We're not trying to ram a particular format down your throat, but to give you a sense of some things that might work effectively for you. I'll provide a schedule of when those need to be returned. This is really part of the process that this class, at the end, before the last session, which will be a mock study section, but before that we'll have several sessions where each of you can present orally your own oral abstract and what your project is. And so this is a sort of three-part process for you to get some suggestions on ways to put together a good abstract, and then to have feedback on the abstract that you've drafted and written, hopefully taking advantage of the information you get today to guide you on how to write your abstract. And when we do the discussion of abstracts, I'll select from the ones that are submitted a few to distribute to other members of this group for you to give a little bit of preliminary feedback on the structure of the abstract, and we'll discuss it as a group too. And this is of course a little bit of exposing yourself, but everything you do as a young faculty exposes your product to your peers, and the more we do it in a setting where people can give you really frank and friendly fire feedback, the better. So we'll talk about the sort of ground rules of how to give each other feedback on academic products so that we do that in a respectful and useful way. So be ready for that. I'll be sending you an email before the end of the week that describes some of the recommendations for how to do that. And the abstracts will be due, I think it's going to be in about 10 days. So this is not something that you should be spending hours and hours working on. It should be something you can do, and we already have got an abstract to start from, and I hope you'll update it based on some of the suggestions Dr. Gregory offers, and then we'll talk about it in a couple of weeks. So this is our first try in this course, having an off-site faculty member, so Dr. Gregory is in New Orleans. There are microphones around the ceiling here. Speak up if you have a question. Ryan Outman, who is the co-director of the training program, is going to help modulate the questions if they're. So Paula, if you don't hear a question effectively, if you don't notice that one's being asked, Ryan will shout out, and we hope to have some real discussion during the session today. Okay, and then just a heads up, Paul, Dr. Gregory has to take a short break at around 8:30, so we'll take our normal break a little bit early. I urge you to hang around, and she'll be back within about 12 to 15 minutes and finish off the session. Okay, good to go. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning. It's so nice to see you guys. I've actually been in that room before, so I remember what a nice room it is. And I don't know how the weather is where you guys are, but we're kind of cloudy and expecting some of the rain from Houston. So you didn't really tune in order to have a weather report, I'm sure. But when I talked to Dr. Chaplin about giving this lecture, the thing I was intrigued about is that, you know, I hadn't really thought about how many different kinds of abstracts there are. So we're gonna talk about the kinds of abstracts. As soon as I get this slideshow to work in here. All right. Also, you guys got the slides from me. They have hyperlinks. I read a lot of different articles and tried to pick a couple and put hyperlinks to them that were short but actually informative and helpful. This is one I thought was really good. I thought this one was funny, especially when you think the first time you write an abstract and your boss says, hey, just go write an abstract for this meeting, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, what am I supposed to say? So it's supposed to be basically like your elevator talk. If you had like 3 minutes and you had to summarize everything, how would you introduce your topic that you're working on? How would you summarize your data? And how would you kind of wrap it up? And there are different components to the abstract, but I like to think about it that way, is grabbing the person's interest with an introductory sentence or two, summarizing what you've been doing, you know, what are your results, and then saying, what do these results mean, and where do you want to go next? So I think there's 3 main types of abstracts. There's publication abstracts, which we're not going to talk much about because every journal kind of has its own rules on how they want them and how long they want them and what format they want them in. What we're going to concentrate on today are meeting abstracts for presentations at national or regional meetings, and grant abstracts. You present a hypothesis-driven research plan, and you summarize your research plan that you're trying to kind of get people to pay for. So I'm going to start with grant abstracts just because I know them better. It should introduce the reader to the problem that you're addressing, what your hypothesis is, and the main techniques you're using. So here's the thing. A grant abstract will have some data sometimes. You have to remember that most federal grants, your abstract is public information. So that's the one thing you want to keep in mind. For foundation type grants or grants from the university, that's not going to be as true. But a grant abstract to the NIH is public knowledge. You'll see in a minute, you see that I have examples of them. So if you have very preliminary data, you may want to be more careful in how you explain or describe that data than in that kind of abstract than you would if you were going to a meeting where there is an assumption of some, you know, not sharing or privacy. So what you're going to want to explain in that abstract is what do you intend to do? Because a grant is kind of, we've got a little data about this thing, but we want to do more experiments, and this is what we hope to find. Why is this work important? That's called the significance. It's important in your grant to explain the significance of the work that you're doing. What's already been done? Now that might, in the abstract, may just be 1 or 2 sentences. And it could be what's already been done by other people and also what's been done by your group. And how are you going to do the work? So before I go much further, one of the other things about grants is that you're trying to convince the reviewer that you are the right people you and your group are the right people to do this research, and you're the right, you have the right idea, you have the right equipment, etc. So all of that has to kind of go into this abstract. So most people will wait and write the abstract, or as it's called, the summary, last, because by then you kind of got your whole research plan worked out and you know where you want to go with this thing. Probably, to me, one of the most important things, both in the specific page of your grant, but also in your abstract for your grant, is a good opening sentence. If you can get me interested in the topic you're working on with the first sentence, that goes a whole long way to getting me to read the rest of it. So I tried to look through a bunch of abstracts, grant abstracts, mostly from UAB, just to get some that I could show you that I thought, oh, this is really interesting. So I have no interest in see, I can't even say it, that word, autosomal recessive chronic kidney disease, blah, blah, blah. But that was bless you, but it was a pretty interesting, it kind of grabbed your attention. It's a primary element of end-stage kidney disease with no effective therapy. So right there, they have identified what they're going to work on, and renal fibrosis, and why it's important. There's no effective therapy available today. So clearly you assume that the rest of the abstract is going to kind of tell how they're going to study this and maybe how this will impact better, more effective therapies, right? 2 sentences and we're already in. So these are some abstracts from folks at UAB. I did 2 things when I was looking for these abstracts, because there are a lot of grants at UAB. We're really jealous down here at LSU. But I looked for grants that have been funded for more than one time, because a lot of times those grants should be more established and more established investigators. So this particular grant they've had for 15 years, so it's been renewed a couple times. They start off by talking about a ligand that's a member of this family, blah, blah, blah. What you can also see here is that they actually, our central hypothesis is, so this is hypothesis-driven research, and this hypothesis is based on our new findings. I think it's always good in an abstract if you can put that one little sentence, you know, our hypothesis is formulated based on what we found so far, and the way we're going to test our hypothesis in our experiments are going to be the specific aims, 1, 2, 3. So they've delineated, they've explained what this issue is that they're interested in, they've explained what their new hypothesis is that's based on their data, and then they've given you an idea of what it is they want to do. And they kind of summarize at the very end, they talk about, you know, rank and rank L is important in bone disease, and a full elucidation of the signaling may guide the development of therapeutic targets for these bone diseases. So they are saying kind of, I like what they're saying. They're not saying we're going to develop and cure osteoporosis, blah, 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 but they do wrap up the whole abstract with kind of an implication. Where is this going to go? Our information is going to add to our understanding of these bone diseases and the targets for treating bone diseases. And if I'm talking too fast, just tell me, because I feel like I'm talking kind of fast because I'm just talking to a computer.
Well, I'm going to just chime in one thing. So our screen is a little bigger than it used to be, but in a slide like this that has a lot of text, it's pretty hard to read. So I think you'll need to actually read exactly what you want people to hear. You can point to it, but I don't think they're going to be able to read it off the screen. Okay,
and they have the slides.
Okay. Yeah.
They got them. Yeah, they got them.
So
I knew that.
They may have I suspect we printed them out a little too small to. Okay, Ryan is doing magic with the screen, so we may be better off. Okay. Good. Move up to the front if you're in the back.
Okay. The second one is a totally different field. So the first one was all the ligands, signaling, etc. This particular abstract starts off with functional decline in patients with mild cognitive impairment. Oh, shoot. Is an important issue in dementia research. So right there they're saying, what is it that they're working on? They're working on dementia research, and it seems like probably it's going to be mild cognitive impairment. It is primarily a cognitive syndrome, and then they describe it. Since they kind of go on to say, since our original application, what we've done right here, the topic has undergone a lot of study. In addition, there's new ways to look at it, etc. What they didn't really give us were any aims, specific aims here. And I'm not saying this is a bad example. I'm just saying this is a different way of describing it. So the aims are way down here at the bottom, really like at the last second thought. Aim 1, 2, we're going to do so-and-so. And what their long-term goals are. So again, a grant application is more about what you're planning to do. You know, we've done a few experiments. Now we want to do a whole big set of experiments. We've done a few experiments. They gave us a hypothesis. Our hypothesis can be tested by doing these experiments. And it's really, I think, it's very hard to write a good abstract because you really have to condense things down. So here's another one. Bradley Yoder, don't know him, but maybe some of y'all do. Primary cilium dysfunction and human syndromes of ciliopathies. I'm like, wow, ciliopathies, interesting. So he explains that there's these mutations, etc. And again, these data, you know, will help us to better understand how cilia dysfunction causes why he wraps up one sentence at the end, just one good sentence at the end, because all of these are going to be limited in how much you can say. So you need to introduce what the problem is, you know, what the interesting, make the disease or the disorder interesting. You need to introduce that. You need to describe what you're going to do, so what methods you're going to use, but not like 5% CO2. Now, that's something, a big, you know, we'll do genomic analysis to try to look at gene expression or look for mutations or whatever. So those are things that I think are important. And then most people in their grant summary will have the aims, but we don't see them here. And then finally, you know, wrap up. Don't leave the abstract just kind of dangling like, we're going to do this, this, and this. Goodbye. You're like, what? What happened? So you want to start with a good introduction. You want to finish with a good, strong sentence at the end. And you may spend more time on those because those are the ones that you're least comfortable with. You're really comfortable with the numbers and the techniques and your patients or your cells that you're going to study or whatever, but you're less comfortable probably with how do I explain this to somebody who may or may not be an expert in the field. So, oh Lord. So we have a technical issue. It says that my computer's battery is running low. So I'm just going to plug you guys in and see. I can't get any technology to work this entire week. So can y'all still see me?
Yeah.
Okay. I know, now you see, like, oh my gosh. What is, okay, that's not going to work either. Okay, so I'm just going to stay. I know! Who would have thought this? So I'm going to sit this way because they say you look thinner from the side. What can I say? You know, if we get through this, we get through anything. All right. So here's another one. This one is a newer grant. It's a little, again, it's just on a different topic. I like the way it was put together because I thought it did a good, it's kind of hard to make kinases really interesting when you're talking about people, anybody can read this abstract. And here's the thing, anyone can read this abstract, like your congressman might read this abstract and you go, why did they get money for this? So you want to make sure that you try to explain in those first couple sentences something that's not too technical, but gets across the point of the significance. And I love this at the end. These studies will also provide rationale for pharmacologic replacement or mimicry of this function in cancer prevention and treatment. It doesn't say we're going to come up with a therapy, and I would caution you against doing that. But I think saying something to the effect of these studies, will help us to understand it so we can come up with better therapies, etc. I think that's quite reasonable. And for those of you that are thinking that, a grant that's a K award, so some of you might be doing fellowships or K awards. You could wrap up your last sentence with these studies will not only help us to understand this problem better, but they will add to my career development and help me to become an independent researcher in this area. So that way you're kind of building in the career development part along with the part, your science part. So, questions about, abstracts for grants. I think they are different because even though you're going to introduce the topic, I think there are a few caveats. You want to be careful about what preliminary data that you put in there unless you are like sending the paper out the next day, because you don't know, it's public. It's a public thing. And so you want to make sure that you kind of keep your data safe. You want to mention, what are your goals with the research? How are you going to do the research? But I think the most important things are convincing the reviewers that you're the right people to do it. And part of that is to have some mention of the literature and or your data. It could be as simple as many studies have identified blank. However, such and such has yet to be discovered. We've found X. So that again, you don't have a lot of room, so you can't spend a lot of time explaining, and you don't want a lot of facts and figures in your abstract. You don't have to tell me that exactly how many people die of prostate cancer every year from this range to this range, and this many are diagnosed, and on and on. I know prostate cancer kills people, and it's a bad problem. So just, get more to something. Don't, especially in the abstract part, don't waste space. Space is a premium. The number of characters and the amount of space you use you've got to be really careful with. Okay? So, questions? What I would suggest when you're writing your summary for your grant is to take your specific aims page and just pare that down, because your hypothesis will be in your aims page, your intro will be in your aims page, your specific aims will be there, and hopefully you'll have like a one-sentence wrap-up. You may have to cut out a lot of detail, like what aim 2 is to look at gene expression, and you might have 4 experiments. No, we'll just say aim 2 is to look at gene expression in the abstract, whereas in the specific aims, you would give specific details. But I find it helpful just to be able to take my aims page and pare that down to a smaller version, which is the summary. Y'all are so quiet. It's because I'm so thin now, right? No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. So I think what I'm going to do, because we just have a couple minutes before I need to run over and get that exam started, and the reason I have to, I don't know how many of you are medical people, but you know, these national exams, only one person is allowed to like tell the students to start the exam. There are 500 proctors, etc., but I'm the one who's like got the start flag. So unfortunately. How many of you are thinking about writing grants? Okay.
About 60%.
Wow, awesome, awesome. So I think that, again, I think the summary, I don't want to say it's an afterthought, but I think the hardest part of the whole grant is the aims page, and you tend to work on it. I work on mine throughout the writing process. I come up with start with something, write some stuff, and then go, oh, maybe we could also do this, and go back and rewrite my aims page. So when my aims page is done and I'm ready to just about finish writing everything up, that's when I write my summary, because I take it from the aims page, which is not the most fun page to write, but it is the most important page, even more important possibly than the abstracts. Okay? So, and I think the other thing to think about is, you know, your abstract for your grant, what would you want your mom to see if she looked at your abstract? So, you know, if you were presenting to your grandma, your mom, because especially if you're writing a K or a fellowship type grant, that you're not going to have a very specific reviewer. So you need to make it a little more generic, and that's true in the abstract as well. Because this is public information, I would make it a little more generic, a little more generalized, a little more clear than if you were writing an abstract for a publication where the readers and the reviewers are all experts on that field. Okay? All right. So we're going to take our break because it's 8:28, and I'll be back at 8:45.
Go ahead and, obviously it's early for a break from what we know, but we're just trying to make everything work. So happy to answer any questions that folks have here while we wait for Dr. Gregory to return, but also to take a break as well.
Okay, are we back?
We're ready to go, guys.
Are we ready?
We're ready.
All right. So when we're writing abstracts for conferences and scientific meetings, the thing is, you know, there's a format for this, but I think the other thing you want to keep in mind is the fact that you're going to have to write and submit this abstract several months before you will actually be presenting. And so a lot of times you may have some data, but you may not have all the data. So the trick is, you know, you can't kind of say, and then we will investigate, you know, don't try to fudge on your data, because the people reviewing the abstracts are going to know. I think the other big mistake people make in abstracts, especially for scientific meetings, is leaving out any details. They just kind of talk about the big problem, but they don't really give very clear description of what they're doing, as well as what their results are and what their conclusions are. What do the results mean? So don't make that mistake. And there's a hyperlink right here, because you can only hook them up to things. This was a really good journal article about mistakes people make and about how to write a good abstract for presenting at a scientific meeting. And the guy wrote it right after he had reviewed a bunch of abstracts for a meeting, and he kind of was like, you know, really? Some of these were ridiculous. So I thought it was, I liked the style of the article. because it wasn't so complicated. It's really only a couple pages, so I think it's very helpful. So one of the things you want to do when you get started on working on your abstract for a meeting, you know, writing the draft for your mentor, you might even just plan to have, and we found X, just put X. Get the whole thing kind of put together and let your mentor look through it and see if he likes the way you've kind of started it. Read through any existing, there should be published abstracts from previous meetings, so you can look at how people formatted, but also kind of how much do they say or not say. And even an abstract that's submitted that gets picked for oral presentation may be a little different from one that is for a poster presentation. So look at both, you know, especially if you have to designate whether you're going to be presenting a poster, you know, planning to do oral, or whether you're planning to, you know, to do a poster presentation. But it gives you a good idea of the style of the abstract, what kinds of things the meeting is likely to be interested in. I mean, the last thing you need to do is send something about cancer to the diabetes meeting, unless you have found the new link between cancer and diabetes. See what I'm saying? And especially if you're going to the diabetes meeting, you need to say, we're really interested in diabetes, happens to cause cancer. Read the guidelines for the abstracts for that meeting. What's the size limit, what's the format, etc. One of the big mistakes I see with students, not so much graduate students, but we have abstracts written by undergrads, and you know, this is a great place for them to learn how to write an abstract, but we had one turn it in with only his name as the author. And we're like, so there's no one in the lab? Oh yeah, well, you need to put them. Oh, even though in the instructions, and we had done a workshop with them, etc., we had said all that, you know, one of the things you're going to have to deal with is coming up with the order of the authors on the abstract. So you need to talk to your mentor about that. Who's on the abstract, who's not on the abstract? Is somebody else in your lab also presenting one, etc. Then when you kind of get a good draft that you like, even again, if you don't have all your data, just kind of put some X's and O's in there, but get most of the wording down. Let someone in the lab read it. Maybe if you're a grad student, let a postdoc read it. If you're a postdoc, let a junior faculty read it. Then give it to your mentor. Once you've kind of got a nice, clean draft, they'll really appreciate that. And say, I didn't want to say anything, you know, the final thing about how many replicates or how many animals or whatever, but I wanted to go on and get started on this. So getting that good draft. I threw this in here because I thought it was funny, because really a lot of abstracts for meetings have such a set format that you could make them these Mad Libs, which is this thing that, you know, kids do where you fill in the blanks. Now, that said, I'm going to tell you something. When I worked at the NIH, we actually, every year we had a retreat for our institute. And people, you know, all the different labs and all the different what they call branches, which would be like departments, presented their posters. Somebody got an idea and they made up a poster. They made the poster, they made the abstract, and they just used words that we used so often. There was no real data, there was no real study. It was a joke. But it was so well written that people would go up to the poster and like, whose poster is this? This is really great. Then it became a competition. So the next year, a different lab did it. And so every year it was a secret who did it, and part of the fun was to figure out who had done it. But the reality is, again, there's such a kind of formulaic part of abstracts that sometimes you could almost just fill in the words. The last thing you want is for someone to say, oh, you're not in the formula. You know, it's better to be formulaic than not. Because with abstracts, there's a certain way that it needs to be put together that people are expecting. And if you don't give them that, they're going to feel like, what's wrong with this? What is this person, you know, what is this person doing? So it's just an idea. Start with your Mad Libs. So I think the things I wanted to talk about too were common mistakes. You know, we talked about an introduction where you have the first 2 or 3 sentences that kind of introduce your topic, and you think of that. I like to think of it almost like an inverted pyramid. So we start with the big scientific problem we're working on, that we're interested in cancer and prostate cancer, and then we get down to gene expression in prostate cancer, and then we get down to health disparities, why African Americans have twice as much. Maybe it's because of changes in gene expression or something. So you start with the big problem, kind of come down, get to the point of explaining your methods and what data you already have, and then in abstracts for meetings, you better have most of your data complete. Now, again, when you start drafting the abstract, you may still be finishing up some experiments, and you can kind of put them, you know, within house X, Y, and Z to be, you know, completed. But before you send that abstract in, you want to have a much clearer idea, you know, have your data pretty solid and ready to go. I think another common mistake, you know, besides just having no detail, and we analyze blah, blah, blah. How? How did you analyze it? You know, so you need to make sure that you get enough detail in there that people are going to believe and be interested in what you did, without having to put every % sign and everything else. Now, in the meeting abstract, you're not going to have necessarily a hypothesis driven. You're just explaining and describing a set of experiments that all have a central theme. And you're also not talking about where you want to go next, because hopefully you've done all the experiment. You're not going anywhere next. That's the difference too between the grant abstract and the meeting abstract. So how about some questions? Man, y'all are silent.
So I have a question. Some of the meetings require you to submit an abstract like 6 months before the meeting. How are you supposed to have all of your data complete 6 months before the meeting?
I know. That's really the challenge. And I think, you know, you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you have all the data, but maybe some experiments you hope to do, you can sometimes, you know, describe that first set of data and say, you know, it's still to be determined whether X, Y, or Z. But you're right. I mean, it's a real challenge when the meetings are so far, you know, so many months away, and most of us are working in the lab right up till the day we get on the plane to go to the meeting. So how do you describe that? I think you have to have some data that's very solid. That's going to help get your abstract up for something more like a platform presentation than just for a poster. On the other hand, you know, the nice thing is if it's a local or regional meeting, usually the time frame is a lot shorter. So it's a lot, you know, the abstracts are due closer to when you're going to be giving the presentation. So you will have all your data. But for national meetings, I think you've got to really play up the data you have and say further experiments are ongoing to elucidate X, Y, and Z.
Kind of along the same lines.
Other questions?
Along the same lines, so like 6 months down the road, if you got more data or better data, do you present that at the meeting, or do you stick with what was in your abstract?
Yes. Sure, you can always present the latest data. I remember going to a meeting and literally somebody had finished the data the day before. And they were like, and you know, we're going to be planning to do this, we just finished it yesterday. So there's nothing wrong with showing the latest, you know, hot off the press data. But the only way you're going to get the abstract accepted is if you have some data in it. Some other questions?
I would just add to that too. each meeting being aware of, sometimes you can designate if it's oral or poster and just kind of be thinking that way as well. I mean, it's a little bit off the track of the abstracts, but just make sure that you designate everything, and if you're presenting, if you're eligible for Young Investigator Awards or other things like that, to make sure you kind of check all the boxes. And think about that too when you're crafting your abstract of how you present it.
I think that's a really important point, is not just to have your abstract in the right format. Again, looking at those previous, abstracts from previous years, you'll see how they designate the authors and how they designate the institutions authors are from, etc. So, don't, have some big and don't have a big typo or something. Spell check is only good for checking things that are misspelled. The difference between rationale and rational is not going to come up in spell check. So, really carefully read through for the grammar, for the punctuation, for the spelling, and again, make sure that you fill out everything for that meeting, indicating, this abstract is for a poster versus this abstract's for an oral presentation. Some meetings they'll say, you can designate oral, but they only pick a certain amount of them that they have as oral, and the rest have to come in as poster presentations.
The other thing to keep in mind with both abstracts that Dr. Gurry's talked about too is when you're limited in space, you kind of start thinking about shortcuts as far as acronyms and other components, but just keep in mind this might be the only thing that they've read, so you still want to make sure that you're spelling things out so they truly know what you're talking about. You can't assume that they've got the full grant, that they're going to read the full grant, or all these times that they're reviewing these stuff, it's in a large stack of other things that they're reviewing.
Yeah, I agree, Ryan, and I think that's a good point too between the three different kinds of abstracts. So if it's a publication abstract or a meeting abstract, those people are in your field at least. They're in a very narrow field, and so you might be able to get away with more abbreviations of very commonly accepted things. On the other hand, in your grant, you need to spell out everything the first time because you don't know who's going to read that abstract, and because it's in the public database, it's in the public domain. So, but I found things where people write, whole long words of things over and over and over, and you don't have to do that either. So make sure if you're going to have an abbreviation that you're using frequently, that you define it in the first sentence or two, and then, and parenthetically, and then move on from there. I mean, the thing with both, for abstracts, both for meetings and for grants, all of them have a limit. So you don't really have, a lot of room to play around and describe 20 other papers or whatever. You really have to be 1 or 2 sentences for each of those major points that we covered. So, a sentence or two about the introduction, like what's the topic and the rationale. Why are we studying this? Is it different in Alabama than it is somewhere else? What is the thing people don't, haven't yet understood? So that's your objectives. What are you trying to determine? Lots of studies have shown X. We are trying to show Y. The methods, be specific. We're going to analyze these animals, run these gels by such and such standard techniques or whatever. Or we've invented a new way to analyze these, and we will describe it in more detail or something like that. What are your results? Summarize your results. Let's say you have a lot of results in one set of experiments but not so many in the other, and it's 6 months before this meeting. So just, put more time and more space to the one where you really have some data, and then say, and we have some data related to this, and I don't like to say too much about will be discussed or will be shown or will just say what you have, And then if you have more when you get to the meeting, that's even bonus. I think it's really important, the conclusions. What do you think the results mean? Where do you think the results fit into the field?
The other way to think about this for all these, but especially for your grant, is this is your elevator speech. This is your concise way to summarize why what you're doing should be funded and why you're the person to do it, especially with what Dr. Gregory mentioned with your K award of why you're the person to be able to do the job.
Right. And it's very easy, especially with basic science, to kind of jump right into the tyrosine kinase, threonine, blah, 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 blah. You need to take the reader by the hand. You know, what does this have to do with the whole big world or with the disease? So if you're sending this to the National Cancer Institute and you're looking at this kinase in cancer cells, start off by saying, you know, that lots of these tumors have this kinase. We are going to look at the kinase and we're going to study this, that, and the other. But you want to ease people in because, again, for Ks and for Fs, the reviewers are not topic experts. You're not writing a manuscript. You are writing something to convince them that this is an important question and that you have an idea of how to address that question. And never make your abstract too, you know, if it's too short, if there's a limit of either characters or lines or whatever, never go below that. Fill it up, because if it's below that, people think there's something wrong. It's not just that you're being concise. It's, oh, wow, there's something wrong. What's wrong with these people? They don't have enough to say. So, you know, make sure it comes out, but don't go over, because they're not going to let you. They'll just cut it off. So it'll stop, you know, be cut off mid-sentence. So make sure, again, that you understand what the page limits are. You know, when we talked about what are the guidelines, even for the summaries in the NIH grant stuff. And let me tell you, and this is just between us, if you want to see a really bad grant abstract, look up any grant that has a Z. So instead of an R or a U, it has a Z. Those are people from the NIH who have to write a little proposal about what they want to do. So it's not they've never written a grant. They probably will never have to write a grant, and they are some of the worst abstracts you will ever see. But I didn't say that. Never heard that from me. Z. Go to the reporter and look up some Z's.
Does anyone else have any other general questions or a specific question about your abstract or how you would frame the project or anything along those lines?
I'm just wondering how do you balance the need to show the interesting finding and at the same time don't let people just take your idea and compete with you.
So balancing making it interesting with making sure they get the big idea? Is that right?
Make sure that they don't steal it as well.
Yeah,
So science.
Oh, yes.
They have a
yes.
bigger lab and they can get it all done sooner.
Right. Well, you know, in the abstract, that's what I was saying. Be very careful about how much you reveal. You can say, our laboratory we've analyzed, you know, we've made this transgenic mouse and have started to analyze it, blah, blah, blah. But you don't have to say it was a Cree, you know, and how we bred it, etc. So kind of, and that's true, you know, I think all along. You have to be careful as to how much of your data, you know, like when you're playing poker, think about you don't show all your cards. But in science, you got to at least show that you have some cards. So I'd be very careful in the grant abstract how much exact data you put. In the specific aims page, yes, because the people reading that grant have signed a confidentiality thing. They are supposed to keep all of that confidential. I have study section on next Monday, and you know, you have to keep that to yourself. versus the abstracts, again, are going to be public. So I would leave off some of the very detailed details.
Just to build on that, two things. Keep in mind that any federally funded grant is technically publicly available. Anyone can request your grant through Freedom of Information Act. I mean, it takes time, but it's available. So, but it's going to be hard for them to probably do that. As far as scientific meetings, I've heard that in some different areas. That's where I would lean heavily on your mentors, your colleagues, of knowing how those meetings tend to go, of if there is a history of people stealing some of your ideas. It's unfortunate, it does happen, but at the same time, to be part of this academic enterprise, whether here at UAB or elsewhere, you're going to have to share your knowledge and what you're proposing to do, and you just got to have some level of trust.
Right, I agree. And sometimes, if you're submitting a grant, I had a friend who was cloning a gene, and he had linkage to that gene. Very good data for linkage to the gene. So he came to me, he said, I need to know what to do because the study section it goes to is in the musculoskeletal. They don't quite understand the genetics except one guy. Unfortunately, the one guy on study section is my direct competitor. I said, well, you just recuse him. He said, but then no one in there is going to understand the data that I'm showing. So what do I do? I said, how far along are you with this data? Do you have a paper? Well, almost. I said, then you don't send the grant in until you have the paper. You send the grant in, and a week or two later you send the paper in. That way that the data that was in the grant is technically preliminary data. It's not published, but you kind of covered yourself by submitting your paper for publication. And because it was very, even the most scrupulous reviewer, if you see, he's going to see where this gene is located. It's not like you have the thing for Men in Black where you can make him forget it. So, so for that, reason, I think some grants you need to actually have almost the finished paper in hand to send off for publication as you are sending in the grant. And then the other thing is then you can update what your grant submission by saying now this has been published. So it's even better data.
Other questions?
Yeah. I think the abstract is hard to write because it's kind of like Campbell's soup. It's condensed. It's very dense, and it kind of has to get everything across in 1 or 2 sentences for each part. So you actually spend sometimes more time kind of crafting those sentences than you would just writing a big section of a paper.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, thanks, Dr. Gregory, for...
Well, I'm sorry for technical issues.